Hello, I'm Amy with Ask a Christian, a small channel devoted to authentic discussion around the Bible, Christianity, and what life looks like following Jesus. Today, I'm partnering with my local church, the Sunnyvale Seventh-day Adventist Church, to respond to a request that we've gotten from the community. 2 weeks ago, we began to anonymously survey some of the people we come into contact with, and we found out that 60% of our respondents said they could use counseling services this coming year, especially surrounding the holidays and grief and the loss of a loved one. So, in order to address this need as quickly as possible, I didn't want to wait till the new year. I have invited a friend, Dr. Pierre Steenberg, the doctor of ministry and pastoral psychology and family therapy. He said that he would give us a few minutes today, despite him being in the middle of a move to Nebraska. He said that he'd love to come on and talk about some of the feelings that come up, especially around the holidays and special events that some of our community members are dealing with. So welcome with me on Ask a Christian, Dr. Steenberg. Hello, how are you doing this morning?
Hello, great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a privilege to serve.
Pierre, I appreciate it. Now, I want to just get an overview because I don't know, and I think it could help people get a little bit of insight into what's going on in their own life. What is grief, and why does it seem to show up so prevalently and so aggressively around the holidays?
Yeah, it's a tough question because it's kind of like love. Everybody knows what it is, but it's kind of hard to define because no matter how you define it, it always falls short somehow. And grief is like that. But basically, grief is a response to loss. Believe it or not, you experience the same process whether you realize that you finally lost your wallet or if some loved one died. It's the same process. It's a response to loss. What most people don't understand is that it's actually a process. It's not an event. It's not something that happens today and is gone tomorrow. For some, it can take a week. For some, it will take months. For others, it might take years. And that's okay. That's normal. It's a process. There are steps you go through in this entire process. It's not just feelings. It's not just emotions. It's this process. Now, mostly to begin with, there's feelings of numbness, sadness, denial. It even moves towards mourning and grief later on, and eventually you get to acceptance. But if you've lost somebody really dear to you, there's no off switch.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's no way to just turn it off and it'll be gone forever. At the end of the day, we simply learn to live with it. We learn to cope. And that's part of the process as well. The second part of your question, why is it so merciless in the holidays?
Mm.
Well, interestingly enough, it just hit me this Thanksgiving a few days ago. I lost in January last year my adopted American father. I have no family, extended family in America since I'm from South Africa. So a family where I pastored first kind of adopted us as their family, and we really are like family. We spend Christmas there and Thanksgiving, etc. And so this Thanksgiving a few days ago, I was there and the table was all set, and it was my job to, as usual, pour the Martinellis. And I got to the seat where he always sat. And as I started to pour, it hit me. So why in holidays? Well, it accentuates the loss. It's a visual reminder that this person's not there. This person's missing. And quite often with holidays, whether you planned it or not, there are rituals involved. The same person does prayer perhaps, or the same person pours the drinks or says the same, makes a speech at a certain time or whatever it might be. But we have these rituals. And so that person is no longer there to participate. We're used to them doing things and being there, and all of a sudden they're not. And we realize the loss again. It reminds us of this loss yet again. And so it brings back all those feelings of sadness, of mourning, of grief. And so that's why the holidays are so terrible for us, because that chair is empty.
Mm.
that person is not there, and we see it. It hits us in the face.
Wow. Yeah. I'm wondering, I wish that we had time for your full seminar on this. And I'm hoping that one day we can have you back to do several parts of this and get into some of the more nuanced parts that I've heard you share. But what do we need to understand about this process that you're talking about in order to kind of make sense of what we're feeling and maybe some of the behaviors? Maybe somebody has things that are just bursting out of their mouth, or they're acting strange to themselves. What do we need to understand about this process that will help us make sense of that?
Sure, yeah. So this process changes over time. Initially, people might be struck with a kind of numbness, some denial. You can't believe this happened. For example, some behaviors that are attached to denial and numbness is you just you're just being. You're not really living. You're not
Mhm.
necessarily taking care of things. You feel overwhelmed with everything, and there's this feeling of numbness. You're there, but you're not quite there. You're just in that zone of just being, existing.
Mhm.
A form of denial is also, for example, not getting rid of clothing, not wanting to change a room, um,
Mhm.
maybe keeping on smelling laundry and that type of thing.
Mm.
Um, all of that, not getting rid of the voicemail, not changing the telephone answering message. These are all things that subconsciously is a hope that perhaps it's temporary, perhaps they're coming back.
Mm.
But once again, that's normal. As long as it doesn't go on too long, that's part of the process. Then from there, we typically move on to some anger. We can be angry at the medical establishment for what they could have or should have done. We can be angry at ourselves. Why did we give the kid the keys to the car, or we should have picked up that something was wrong, or whatever it might be. We might be angry if you're a believer at God, that perhaps you prayed and He didn't save the person. So there's feelings of anger that bursts forth. And then
Mm.
over time, that changes to grief, where we just mourn the loss. We're sad. We miss the person. We might be lonely. Even though we might be with a lot of people, we're lonely because that void is not filled. And eventually, we get to a stage where, as I've said before, we accept it and we simply learn to live with it. We, at that stage, can go back to memories without deep pain. There's always
Mm.
little pain. But if you go back to deep pain, then you're not really at the acceptance phase yet. Then you're still at the stage where you articulate between grief on the one hand and acceptance on the other hand. So, why is this so difficult for people to manage if it's so reasonably straightforward? Well, first of all,
Mm.
you can't control the process. To some people, it's short, to others, it's long.
Wow.
Secondly, we're at different phases of this process. It's not uniform for all people. So let's say that you and I are siblings and we just lost a parent. You, for example, might be at stage 3 grief, where I'm still at stage anger.
Mm.
Quite often, this happens in marriage as well. When you lose a child to death, the husband, the males, typically tend to be stuck at the anger stage longer, whereas the females tend to move towards the grief phase quicker and stay there longer. And quite often, we misunderstand each other's needs, and we're not there for each other during that time. The conversation in your mind goes something like this. The guy says, "This wife of mine didn't care for our beloved John. Because if she did, she would be angry at the physician. She'll be angry at the drunk driver. She'll be angry at whatever. And the fact that she's not angry at anything tells me that she doesn't care."
Wow.
But at the same time,
Hmm.
the wife thinks, "My husband doesn't care and does not love our John, because if he did, he would mourn. Look at him. He's not even crying. He's not even sad. He's not even missing John." And so there's this misunderstanding, and they're not there for each other. They're not um, fulfilling each other's needs during this time, because they're on totally two different planets. And that's part of why it's so difficult to understand this process, because we're at different phases. Here's a few things I'd like to say. Unless your friends warn you that they see something untowards, what you're going through is probably normal.
Hmm.
It's just pain. It's just painful. Know that you can't control the process. There are things to help you go through the process more thoroughly, may speed it up somewhat, but there's no off switch. And it just takes time, a long time, for some years.
You know, that's really reassuring in a way. I know that some people that I've been talking to, they are wondering, they're asking, is this normal? You know, I feel like I should be further along by now, but that's undue pressure, you're saying. They're comparing themselves to someone who went through a phase more quickly than they did.
Yeah, this process, even though we know the basic stages and the basic steps, is still different for everybody. Even in those steps, some grieve differently from others. One person might just keep it in and withdraw and become silent and don't talk, while another person tells everybody and cries at the mere thought. So even in the same process, we exhibit the different behaviors as we go through that process. So yes, it is a basic process, but it's not the same for everybody.
Mm-hmm. I know that self-reflection at the time of grief is really important for helping people make sense of themselves and communicate what's going on. So, what are some of the questions we can ask ourselves or ask someone who's going through grief to help give them an outlet and maybe provide a safe place for them to talk and heal?
Amy, I'm so thankful you've asked this question, because most people, when they come to a seminar like this or want to learn how to deal with grief to help others, they're always worried about what to say.
Mm.
And there's always this awkwardness. And we stop being friends or being close to them because we're fearful that we don't know what to say, and that somehow we think that we have to have some magical words that will bring comfort. But that's far from the truth.
Mm.
I love your question, because you're saying that we should ask. In other words, allow them to talk. You don't have to have magic answers or great one-liners or anything like that at all. In fact, I'm in chaplaincy training as well, and have completed my first unit of clinical chaplaincy training. And they hammer into our heads that it's all about the ministry of presence, being there, being
Wow.
an ear. It's not about what you say. So yes, by all means, ask. Here are a few things that you can ask. First of all, ask permission to ask before you ask.
Mm.
Sometimes the person is not just quite ready to talk about it yet. Perhaps it's too painful. Perhaps it's too raw. And so when you start off with questions that they're not there yet, and the pain is too deep, they're not going to want to talk. So start by asking permission. Is it okay if we talked about this? May I ask you a few questions about what you're going through? Ask permission first. Once you get permission, then ask about, let's assume you're speaking to somebody that lost someone, rather than asking yourself, I'll get to that in a minute. But ask questions about the person they've lost. My uncle, for example, lost his son right after high school in a car accident.
Mm.
Years later, we talked, and he said to me, Pierre, I had a desire to talk about my son. But because people think that they've got to have something to say, people acted as if he never existed. Nobody would ever mention his name. Nobody would ever ask. Nobody would ever give me the opportunity to talk about my son. I want to talk about my son. So go ahead. Ask them about the person. Ask them about their favorite memories. Ask them what
Mhm.
they would like to remember most about the person. You want
Yes.
to ask things to help them summarize their relationship and their memories. You want to assure them that you're just there to listen. You don't have to say much. Now, here's a few don'ts. Don't think that you have to have answers. Please do not compare your grief or your past stories or any past stories that you've heard from anybody else with their grief. Simply allow them to grieve. A friend of mine by the name of Nicola has a ministry, and she always says the only cure for grief is to grieve. And so the part we can play is to allow them the freedom to do so, to create that comfortable space for them to grieve. If they feel like crying, let them cry on your shoulder. If they feel like talking, let them talk. If they feel like they need to be silent and don't want to talk, then just be there for them. Help them with chores and things, because at least in the initial stage of numbness, people don't want to mess with that. That's why quite often we take food to people that have lost somebody. In that stage of numbness, they don't want to take care of life. They're overwhelmed. Just be there, do that for them. Now, what about asking yourself? Because we all also lose people. And how can you make sure that you're going through the process well? Well, just be aware of which stage you're at, and then do what's best to help you with that stage. For example, if you're angry, then express that anger tangibly, physically, to things instead of people. Because quite often we express them to people. We're angry at people and we snap and so forth, and we hurt the relationship. But you can channel that anger towards things instead. Go to a field, pick a rock, and just hurl rocks at it. Pick up a stick, go and beat a rock with it. Let that anger come out. That's okay. On the other hand, if you notice that you're grieving more and you feel like crying, cry. Talk about it. It's really important. And perhaps we can get to that a little bit later on as well.
Okay. Thank you, Pierre. I'm wondering, a lot of this is happening inside of our heads, and I know that that's probably some of the best work that we can do for ourselves and with others. Talking, letting them talk, like you said. But are there any practical techniques or tangible aids for people who are feeling stuck, especially during the holidays, and they want to be there for the rest of their family? They want to be there, for their kids and be present. Are there any kind of aids or any kind of techniques that people can use just to get through the holidays?
Sure. I would actually say start before the holiday comes. The holiday's on a fixed date. We know when it's coming.
Yes.
We want to start a few weeks even before. And here's what I would suggest. Quite often, when death interrupts life, we're dealing with more than just grief. Quite often, we have additional emotions attached to it that can and should be sorted out before the holiday comes. For example, some might feel guilty that they lent John the keys to the car, guilty that they should have noticed that John's cough didn't get better, or whatever it is. And we have feelings of guilt. Well, that should be addressed, hopefully at least to start with that before the holiday comes. You want to minimize the amount of emotions and baggage that we carry, and maybe baggage is a bad word, burden that we carry. We want to minimize that as much as possible before the holidays, because we know additional burdens are going to be heaped on our shoulders when that holiday comes. So go and deal with and ask yourself, what additional emotions am I going through? Am I feeling feelings of guilt? Do I have feelings of regret? Perhaps the relationship wasn't as close as what it could have been. Are there relationships I need to heal? Have we been fighting about the estate and about money, etc.? You want to deal with those things and heal those as best you can, or at least start before the holiday actually comes, to minimize the load you're going to have to bear when that holiday actually arrives. So that's one thing that you can do. Also, you want to make sure that you care for others. Remember, you were not the only person that lost someone. The other loved ones also lost. So try and just care for them. Maybe just physically caring for them and being that ear for them to cry on and to speak to. I would also say, and you're going to laugh at me, but I'm dead serious. A great technique is to cry. There's a good reason as to why people feel calmer and just feel better after a good bout of crying. There's been some studies, and I know there's been some studies also that have kind of said, well, perhaps we're taking it too far than we should. But there have been studies that have shown that crying secretes cortisol from our body. And cortisol is the neuro drug hormone, neurochemical that riles us up, that gives us get up and go and so forth. And that's why crying calms us down. 45% of men never cry. Give yourself permission to cry if you feel like crying. That's okay. And gentlemen, when women cry, typically we don't know how to deal with it and we just want to run. Just stick around. You don't need to do anything. Just hold and hug. That's all that's required. You're not asked to necessarily cry with them if you find that difficult, but cry if you want to. Permit yourself. Also, you want to be talking about it if you feel up to it. Talking is brilliant for grief. Let's go back. There's a reason why babies can't talk when they're born. Talking is a learned skill. Your brain does not natively work in language and words. Your brain works with concepts, feelings, emotions, ideas. Language is a skill we learn that encodes those things into codes called words so that we can transmit them to someone else so that they can decode them in their brain back into the same thoughts, feelings, ideas, concepts, etc. So where these emotions of grief, etc., takes place in the brain is more in the midbrain that deals with emotions, whereas the language center of the brain is more to the sides of the head here. It's totally different part of the brain. So in order for you to verbally articulate what you're going through or what you feel, the brain has to process it because it doesn't come native. It's got to think about how to best encode it, etc. And that process is very, very good for your grieving process. It helps your brain to make sense of things. And psychology tells us if we can't make sense of things, it drives us nuts. So you want to ask, is there any question that I still have regarding what happened or why it happened? See if you can find answers to those. Making sense helps. And then talk to people. And by the way, if you can't find anybody to talk to, talking to your pet is just as good. There's been research on that. You can talk to your dog. And oh, by the way, if you're a believer, God is a wonderful listener too. Just talk and share what you're going through. It really helps. Just talk.
Pierre, I think, all of the people I can think of who I know are going to watch this, I've got a handful who are excited and waiting for this, are women. And they're going to really resonate with the crying part of that. They feel it. They've told me they feel better after they cry. It does help process for some reason. But the gentlemen I'm thinking about are not down with it. They're going to hear you. They're going to believe you. But I don't know if they know how to take action on that. Have you ever talked to a guy about finding a safe place to cry or overcoming some of the stigma that our society has put out and beat into the male mind for the last couple hundred years?
Actually, it's not just the stigma and our socialization that prevents men from crying. Many of them, even if you were to pay them to, can't.
Wow.
It just doesn't come. Internally, they're even begging for the tears to come. It doesn't come. So it's not necessarily just limited to socialization, because if that was the case, then surely a guy would have the freedom to drive somewhere with his car and just sit in his car where there's no one around and cry because nobody's going to know, right? But even then, they can't do it. So I agree with you. Many men will just say, I can't. I wish I could, but I can't. And
Mhm.
that's okay. Then just talk about it more. It really helps. Um, Perhaps let me illustrate it in a different way. Take yourself back to math class in high school. You're struggling with a problem that you just can't solve, no matter how you try, no matter from what perspective you come to this problem, you can't solve it. So what do? You raise your hand. The teacher comes over. And now you're starting to explain to the teacher, verbally out loud, obviously,
Mhm.
what you don't understand about the problem. And guess what? Halfway through your explanation, never mind, I got it. What just happened? You tried for an hour to solve the problem and you couldn't. And within minutes of trying to articulate out loud to the teacher what you don't understand, all of a sudden you get it. Why? The brain had to encode the abstract thinking into words. And that requires processing. And in the midst of that, and you hearing it, etc., your brain begins to make sense of it. All of a sudden, things click and you got it. So to the guys out there, if you can't cry, that's okay, as long as you give yourself permission to cry if
Mhm.
you can and if you feel the urge to. But if you can't, talk, talk, and just deal with it symptomatically. If you feel anger, as I say, go and express it to something. If you feel grief, talk about how you feel. Even to your dog, it works.
That's so awesome. Thank you so much for that clarification and for your time here with us today. I see we're coming up on the half-hour mark, and I want to ask you before we have to go, um, are there additional resources that you can recommend for those who are wanting knowledge about this process and support and hope during this grieving process?
Sure, there's always support groups. Whichever area you're at, if you search the internet, I'm sure you'll find some support groups. Sometimes they're at churches. Sometimes they're groups like Alcohol Anonymous, but just for grief.
Mhm.
So those groups are very, very helpful. There's something about doing it in a group versus alone that is extremely helpful. You start seeing that you're not alone, that other people are going through similar things than you, and it's very, very comforting. So go and join a support group. You don't have to do it forever, just until you feel like you're okay.
Mhm.
Secondly, there's always great books. I can recommend a website and a book from Karen Nicola, whom I mentioned before.
Mhm.
They actually lost their son, and as a result, she started studying grief and became an expert in grief. And so she runs this ministry of helping people with grief, and it's called uh, what is it called? A Comfort of the Day. So if you just Googled comfort for the day or comfort of the day, I think it's comfort for the day, you'll see her resources as well. And then lastly, I want to say if you have a hunch that what you're going through is not normal, especially if your friends and family express concern over you, then by all means reach out to professional help. Go and see a therapist. Go and see a psychologist. I know there's some people have a stigma to that as well. But hey, what's the difference between seeing a doctor when you've got kidney disease and seeing somebody else when you've got a thinking disease, or your brain chemicals are not right, or whatever it might be? It's the same thing. Just go and get help. These people are well trained and they can help you through the process.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Steenberg. A joy as always. And I don't know how I'm going to coerce you to come back and do more, but I'm gonna put my thinking cap on and figure out a way. Um, is there anything else that you wanted to say about grief or loss that I didn't ask you, that is just something that you've noticed in your time actually counseling families and folks through this?
Well, perhaps cut each other some slack. I can tell you that a couple or couples that have no major marital issues in their life, if they lost a child, a dependent child, to death, 90% of those couples end up with marital problems within 3 years. 60% of them end up getting divorced within 5. So, and part of that is because we're at these different stages and things, but you want to be cutting your family slack. When they're at the anger stage, they might say some things that hurt you. Don't take it personally. Just realize it's part of the grief process. Give them some slack. Just allow them to go through what they're going through. Don't take it personally. Don't be offended. Just give them some grace.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. I will put some of the links of the resources you mentioned in the comments, so those of you who are watching can check those out. And thank you again, Dr. Steenberg. I'll see you soon, probably in Nebraska one of these days.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to share with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.